The mist clung to the mountains like a secret too ashamed to lift, tendrils of fog wrapping tightly around the pines as Detective Ray Mercer stepped out of his vehicle and adjusted the strap of his pack, his eyes scanning the dense, silent forest that loomed ahead. Beside him, Valor, a grizzled German shepherd with more field hours than most rookie officers, sniffed the air with practiced purpose, ears twitching, nose low, already absorbing what the human senses could not. And while Ray had long learned to trust the dog's instincts more than his own gut, something today felt off. Skewed, like stepping into a memory that wasn't his to recall. The trees stood unnaturally still, their needles motionless despite the biting autumn wind that should have stirred them, and as the detective adjusted his coat and began the trek along the faint trail last used by park rangers a week ago, a single thread of smoke rising in the distance told him they weren't alone. Not here, not now, not ever. The missing teenager, Isaac Romero, last seen hiking with two friends who had returned bloodied and incoherent, had vanished in this very patch of wilderness. And now, only silence remained, broken only by the haunting call of a raven overhead, its wings carving slow circles in the gray sky above them like a vulture with better manners, a silent mourner at a funeral no one had planned. This wasn't the first time, though, and that's what sat heavy on Ray's shoulders, heavier than the rifle strapped to his back, or the responsibility that came with carrying both hope and dread in equal measure. It was the third child, the third vanishing, the third family left in tatters by the forest's cruel indifference. And somewhere deep inside, Ray suspected this one would not be the last. Still, he moved forward, every crunch of leaf under boot sounding like a scream in the quiet. And with every turn of the trail, Valor's posture shifted, tense but unalarmed, until a torn scrap of red fabric snagged on a low branch forced them to stop. Ray reached out, fingers brushing the frayed edge, and instantly he remembered the mother's description. A red windbreaker, size medium, his favorite, and his stomach twisted. Valor gave a soft whine, almost reluctant, as if whatever trail they were now on was one they would not want to see to its end. But Ray pushed forward because that's what they did, what they always did. Not just chase ghosts through trees, but carry the weight of stories unfinished, of cries unanswered. And somewhere in this God-forsaken sprawl of branches and stone was an answer no one wanted but everyone feared. One hinted at in the claw marks etched deep into tree trunks, and the way sunlight refused to touch the forest floor. One whispered in nearby towns through cracked lips over late-night drinks. The cabin that sees, but never speaks. The trail had twisted through gnarled roots and breathless silence for hours. The sun now, buried behind layers of charcoal clouds that cast a cold, bluish sheen over the forest floor, when Valor, so sure-footed, so relentlessly focused, came to a dead stop on a moss-choked path flanked by leaning birches and dead fern. His body stiffened like stone, hackles rising slowly, his growl low and guttural, vibrating the air with an edge Ray hadn't heard since their confrontation with that armed suspect years ago in the warehouse district. A growl not of alert, but of warning, primal and resolute. Ray stepped beside him and followed his partner's gaze, and there it was, nestled in the trees like it had grown from the earth itself. An old cabin, grayed and slouched, its roof sagging under the weight of age and secrets, shutters hanging like crooked eyelids over glass windows dusted with grime and time. The whole place looking less like it had been built, and more like it had always existed, a wound in the world that refused to heal. Ray's breath hitched, throat tightening around the cold air as his eyes narrowed, trying to decode the stillness that cloaked the structure like a shroud. And that's when he noticed. No bird song, no rustling underbrush, not even the wind stirred here, as if the cabin sucked motion from its surroundings, a stillness so complete it was suffocating. His pulse quickened, a thunder in his ears, and though he'd stood at the edge of danger more times than he could count, this moment felt different, like standing at the mouth of something ancient and watching it breathe. Hand trembling, not from fear, he told himself, but the cold. Ray reached slowly toward the door, a simple wooden slab with peeling green paint, his fingers brushing the splintered frame when Valor snarled, deep and sharp, then lunged forward a step only to halt again, muscles taut like a coiled spring, eyes locked on the threshold with uncharacteristic terror. Never before had Ray seen his partner freeze like this, not in fire, not in flood, not even under gunfire. And that sent a jolt through him, not just of caution, but of a sudden and unexplainable dread, a voice in his head whispering that if Valor wouldn't go in, maybe he shouldn't either. But duty, memory, and something else, something older than logic, pushed him to lift his foot, place it on the first wooden step, and lean in close enough to hear the faint creak of movement inside, or perhaps only the echo of his own doubt. Behind him, Valor let out a whimper, a sound so rare it felt like an omen, and Ray hesitated, his hand still inches from the knob, caught in the liminal space between courage and consequence, standing before a door that had not opened in years, but might today decide to do so on its own. The silence shattered not with a bang, but a breath, a long, aching creak that sliced through the stillness like a blade through silk, and Ray's spine stiffened as the cabin door slowly, deliberately drifted inward, its rusted hinges moaning a sound that felt less mechanical and more like a groan of reluctant invitation. For a second, neither man nor dog moved, both frozen in the weight of that moment, the kind of moment that splits memory in two, before the door opened and after. Inside, shadows draped every surface like funeral cloth, the interior swallowed by layers of dust and darkness, and yet not untouched. No, not abandoned, because in the center of the single-room cabin sat a wooden table, and on it 2 places were set. Ceramic plates, chipped but clean, silverware placed with intention, and meals prepared. Steaming no longer, but visibly fresh, congealed gravy over slices of roast, bread softened by time but not mold, a pitcher of water beaded with the memory of condensation. The hearth, made of dark stone, still glowed faintly, embers whispering that someone had been here not long before, or perhaps still was. Ray scanned the room slowly, his breath caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat, while behind him Valor emitted a low growl, followed by a whine, then another growl, the rhythm unnatural and distressing, like the dog was being pulled between 2 instincts, to flee and to guard, to warn and to obey. And Ray knew enough to realize that something was deeply wrong, not just wrong in the logical sense, but wrong in the way a dream warps the familiar into the terrifying, when the laws of reality buckle and the familiar becomes the snare. He whispered a command without conviction, a hollow murmur of, "Stay close," and crossed the threshold, boots pressing into floorboards that groaned underfoot, like they remembered every step ever taken across them. Dust swirled in the dim light, slicing through cracks in the boards, and the scent that hit Ray wasn't rot, as he expected, but lavender and cooked meat and something else beneath it, a sweetness, artificial and cloying, like candy left too long in the sun. He stepped deeper, gaze flicking to corners where shadows seemed too thick, too still, hand hovering near the holster on his hip. And just as he turned his head to call for Valor, the door behind him slammed shut with a force that shook the walls, the echo ricocheting through the room like a gunshot in a canyon, and Ray spun on his heel, heart now jackhammering in his chest, only to see the door sealed, unmoving, as if it had never opened at all. And outside, Valor's growling ceased entirely, replaced by silence so complete, so cruel, that Ray found himself suddenly, utterly alone, inside a place that felt less like a building and more like a memory given form. Ray's breath hitched as he turned from the door and scanned the interior with renewed purpose, his training clawing its way to the surface, despite the raw chill of unease spreading through his limbs like frostbite. The cabin's silence had a shape now. It wasn't empty. It was waiting. And every creak beneath his boots, every whisper of ash in the fireplace felt like an inhalation before something terrible exhaled. He moved carefully, hand trailing along the coarse wood of the cabin wall until his fingers caught on something rough. Not splinters, but carvings, shallow at first, then deeper, more deliberate, like a message dug out by shaking hands, desperate hands. And as his eyes adjusted to the low light, he saw them. Names. Dozens of them, etched in uneven lines across the far wall, some scratched so violently the wood bled out in dark rivulets of time-stained resin, each name a scar, a record, a confession. They weren't just names. They were the missing, the forgotten, the ones who vanished into smoke and were never spoken of again. And as Ray's gaze followed the list downward, his heart caught in his throat when he reached the final name, freshly carved, still surrounded by flaking shavings of wood. Isaac Romero. His lips parted in disbelief, and a deep emotional tremor thundered beneath the armor of his logic. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't happenstance. And for the first time in a long time, Ray felt something close to fear blooming behind his badge, a fear that whispered this place was not merely the scene of a crime. It was the crime, and maybe always had been. He stepped back, eyes flickering across the rest of the list, and then he froze again, not from the cold, but from the dagger of memory that stabbed through him. Jonah Wells. There it was, etched mid-column, the name of a 15-year-old kid who'd disappeared 12 years ago in a nearby county, the very first missing persons case Ray had shadowed as a rookie, a case that had haunted him, a case that ended in silence and a mother's weeping that never quite left his ears. His hands shook as he reached for the small writing desk by the window, dust dancing in the air as he pried open a drawer with a hesitant push. Inside, a battered leather journal, its cover cracked like old skin, and when he opened it, the first page held a single sentence in bold, angular script. The cabin doesn't hide. It remembers. His eyes lingered on the words, the truth of them crawling under his skin like insects, because something about this place, this thing, wasn't just watching, it was keeping, collecting stories like bones in a cellar, and Ray began to feel the walls weren't made of timber, but of memory, soaked in grief and wrapped in silence, waiting for someone foolish enough to read it all. Outside, the muffled sound of scratching claws broke through the silence like a heartbeat returned to a still body, and Ray's pulse surged with it. Valor was moving again, frantic, pacing just beyond the sealed door like he could feel something rising beneath the floorboards, something buried but restless. Ray followed the sound across the creaking planks until his boot struck a slight raise in the floor, subtle but unmistakable, and kneeling, he ran his hand along the seam where wood met. Wood, and found the faint groove of a hidden hatch, old, dust-caked, but worn smooth around the edges like it had been opened before, too many times, maybe by those who never returned. Valor barked sharply from outside, his voice laced with urgency, and though every nerve in Ray's body screamed to leave it alone, to walk away, to wait for backup that would never come in time, his hand closed around the iron loop embedded in the hatch and pulled. With a moan of reluctant hinges, the trapdoor opened inward, revealing a narrow staircase carved in stone and swallowed by darkness, the smell of damp earth and rust coiling up like a serpent from the depths. A single exposed light bulb dangled above the stairwell, flickering like a dying firefly, its frail glow casting crooked shadows on the walls that danced with every tremble of Ray's breath. And for a moment he just stood there, one foot on the threshold, the other still planted in a room that had already betrayed him, caught in the stillness between curiosity and doom. The journal's words echoed in his mind. The cabin remembers. And somehow he knew the basement was where it remembered best, where its secrets were carved not in ink or wood, but in silence and fear and bone. Valor barked again, louder now, pawing at the outer wall with desperation, as if trying to claw his way inside, or maybe trying to dig something out. And Ray swallowed hard, drawing his flashlight and pistol in one hand, descending the first step with leaden feet. The bulb above him buzzed and flickered again, casting light that stretched and snapped like rubber across the wet stone walls. And as he moved deeper, the wooden hatch creaked shut behind him with the quiet finality of a confession. He paused at the landing, heart hammering like a war drum, and though the darkness below didn't move, it felt aware, like a beast holding its breath. Without warning, the light went out, plunging him into blackness broken only by the faint red beam of his flashlight as it scanned the stairwell, and a single thought carved itself into his mind like a curse. Sometimes the monsters we chase are the ones we bury. The flashlight beam trembled with every step as Ray descended deeper into the earth, his breath shallow and uneven, sweat slicking his palms despite the clammy cold that clung to the stone walls like mildew-scented regret. At the bottom of the staircase, the floor leveled into a low-ceilinged room carved crudely into bedrock, the air thick with rot and something bitter, something like fear gone stale. And there, illuminated by the weak arc of his light, were chains, thick and rusted, bolted into the stone with iron rings so heavy they looked older than the cabin itself, as if they'd been waiting long before any structure was ever built atop them. The chains were not merely restraints. They were statements, each link screaming that someone had been kept here, many someones, and the darkened stains beneath them, dry but unmistakable, were stories unto themselves, stories that did not end well. Beside them, on a rickety metal stand, sat an old VHS camcorder, out of place in this subterranean dungeon, yet eerily intact, its red recording light blinking steadily, impossibly, like a pulse in a corpse. Ray's stomach lurched as he reached for the device and slid the tape free, then located an old television in the corner, its screen dusty but intact, its cords slithering into the shadows like roots. With a click and a hum, static bloomed across the screen before resolving into footage, grainy, colorless, but horrifyingly clear. A series of faces, one after another, seated against the same stone wall Ray now stood before, each person dirty, bruised, hollow-eyed, speaking with the lifeless rhythm of confession extracted through exhaustion. Some cried, others stared blankly, as if already gone. One woman repeated the same phrase again and again. He watches, he listens, he makes us speak. Another man sobbed as he begged for forgiveness, though for what, he never said. Ray's hand clenched unconsciously, knuckles white, until the footage cut suddenly to black, then flared back with a final clip, the most recent, and there, blinking in the flickering light, was Isaac Romero, eyes swollen but lucid, voice no louder than a whisper as he leaned toward the camera and said, he said, "Truth dies with silence." The screen went blank. The camcorder let out a mechanical sigh as it stopped, and in the stunned quiet that followed, Ray felt the air shift, not in the basement, but above, as Valor exploded into a frenzy of barking overhead, paws pounding against the floorboards like war drums. A frenzy so intense Ray's body responded instinctively, dropping the tape to the stone with a sharp clatter as he drew his weapon, heart stammering, eyes locked on the stairwell behind him. Someone was upstairs, someone who hadn't been there before, or worse, had always been. And whatever waited in the cabin above had heard the footage, had felt the truth stirring, and now it was moving. Ray's boots slammed against the stone steps as he surged upward, lungs burning with the surge of adrenaline and dread now indistinguishable in his veins. The memory of Isaac's whisper still ghosting through his ears as Valor's barking above grew erratic. Not defensive, not aggressive, but panicked. The sound of something cornered and unsure whether to fight or flee. Light from the cabin above grew closer with each step, but Ray's flashlight flickered wildly in his grip, casting seizures of shadow that danced along the narrow walls like mocking silhouettes. He reached the hatch and threw it open with a grunt, sweeping his weapon across the room. Empty. No sign of movement, no shifting shadows, no breathing but his own. And Valor, his stalwart, fearless partner, was cowering in a corner, ears pinned. Back, tail low, eyes fixed not on the door but the old transistor radio on the mantel that had just crackled to life, with a static-laced whisper. "Ray." The voice curled through the air like smoke, aged and rasping but familiar, so familiar that Ray's grip faltered for a second, just one trembling heartbeat of disbelief, before the voice returned, clearer, cutting through the static like a scalpel through skin. "Ray Mercer, you never knew when to quit, did you?" And that was when his mouth went dry, his jaw clenching, because that voice belonged to Detective Eli Crane, his old mentor, his friend, his shadow in the academy, and his moral compass on the field. The same man who had vanished during an undercover operation 15 years ago, presumed dead after months of silence and a botched retrieval. His badge returned to the department in a sealed envelope with no note, no answers. Ray had mourned him, had lived with the guilt of not pushing harder for the truth. And now, that voice, unmistakably his, was speaking through a device that had no power source, no reason to function, yet glowed now with a sickly orange light. Valor whimpered again, crawling closer to Ray's leg, pressing into him for grounding as the voice continued, softer now, almost regretful. "You were never supposed to find this. Not you," it said. And those last two words hit like a bullet to the chest, soaked in a grief Ray didn't understand, but felt down to his marrow. Because beneath them was an accusation, a warning, and something colder. Resignation. The room seemed to thicken with pressure, every surface holding its breath, as if the cabin itself had been listening, and now the act of knowing had changed everything. Ray stepped toward the radio, but it hissed violently, flaring with static and then silence, dead as if it had never spoken. And for a moment he stood frozen in a storm of questions, his heart pounding not just with confusion, but with betrayal. Outside, the wind began to howl for the first time all day, rattling the windows as if echoing the words now carved into his mind. "You were never supposed to find this." Ray stood there, staring at the dead radio, silence collapsing over him like the ceiling might follow, the voice of Eli Crane still echoing through the hollow spaces in his mind, a voice that had once steadied him through chaos, now twisting around the truth like a serpent made of memory and ash. The room felt colder now, tighter, like the cabin had exhaled something foul and was waiting for his next move. But before Ray could take another step toward the mantel or the journal on the desk, Valor nudged him hard, almost aggressively, with a sharp whine that was neither plea nor panic, but pure, urgent insistence. Ray looked down, confused, and Valor locked eyes with him, not afraid now, but intent, his body low and muscles tight, the leash dragging behind as he began pulling toward the door, pawing at it with quiet desperation, every inch of his trained posture screaming one command: "We need to leave." Ray's instincts roared in opposition, heart still tethered to the tapes, the names on the wall, the voice that should not be alive, that must not be. And yet, something deeper than logic, the place where loyalty lives, was shifting under his feet. His mind flashed to the academy, to long nights on patrol with Crane, when the man had told him over stale coffee and quiet radios. "When your partner senses danger, Mercer, listen, don't lead. A dog doesn't doubt. A dog doesn't lie." And now here Valor was, pulling, insisting, knowing, while Ray stood rooted in the ruins of his need for answers, torn between the shadows that begged to be illuminated and the partner who had never failed him. Outside, the trees moved again. Not wind, no. It felt like something larger, some presence circling the perimeter of their hesitation. And Valor growled low, not at the cabin, but at the air beyond, toward the woods, as if something else had awakened there. Something only dogs understood. Finally, with a bitter swallow, Ray holstered his weapon and whispered, "Okay, boy, you lead," and opened the door. The light outside was grayer than before, more drained, but Valor didn't hesitate, charging into the brush with purpose, and Ray followed, casting one last look over his shoulder. The cabin looked smaller now, slumped deeper into the earth, like it was retreating into itself, withdrawing its secrets, its eyes closing. Every step away felt like peeling off a layer of skin, a slow shedding of what he'd almost become inside, a man consumed by ghosts, trapped in answers that wanted to be questions. And as they vanished into the undergrowth, twigs snapping underfoot and branches clawing at their passage, Ray felt something loosen in his chest. Not peace, not clarity, but a faint sense of choosing life over legend, truth over obsession, and the silent promise between a man and his dog that some doors should never be opened, no matter how long they've waited. As Ray and Valor reached the thinning edge of the woods, breath ragged and limbs aching with the weight of everything unspoken, something made them stop. A shift in the air, a heat that did not belong to the chill of dawn. They turned in unison, and through the branches behind them, the cabin erupted in a silent bloom of orange and red, flames swallowing the roof in hungry licks, smoke billowing upward like a signal to no one. No sound of ignition, no flash or explosion, just sudden roaring fire, as if the structure had chosen this moment to consume itself rather than be witnessed any longer. Ray stood frozen, heart thudding in disbelief as he tried to process the impossible. There had been no spark, no accelerant, nothing left behind but his own footprints, and yet the flames climbed higher, windows shattering outward like screams too long, stifled, wood blackening into char and memory. But then, amidst the swirling chaos, a figure appeared, standing in the doorway framed by fire, silhouette perfectly still, and though the smoke obscured all detail, Ray knew with a certainty deeper than logic that it was Eli Crane, or whatever was left of him, a presence half man, half remnant, watching not with malice but with sorrow, shoulders bowed in a posture of release, of finality, as if the cabin had kept him all these years. And now, with its secrets touched by light, it was letting him go. The figure raised a hand, not in warning, not in threat, but in farewell, and then stepped backward into the inferno, swallowed in an instant by smoke and flame, leaving nothing but a void in the doorway where truth had once stood. The rising sun broke over the ridge behind them at that very moment, casting long, golden rays through the canopy, setting the forest aglow in contrast to the black smoke rising behind, light-piercing shadow in stark, radiant streaks, as if the world itself was reclaiming balance. Not peace, not yet, but possibility. Ray knelt beside Valor, who panted quietly now, gaze still fixed on the fire, but no longer afraid. Just watchful, just knowing. And Ray felt the burn of unshed tears, not for the cabin, or even for the victims, but for the years he had spent searching for clarity in silence, and how silence, when cracked open, doesn't scream, it reveals. He looked toward the smoldering ruin, ash falling like snow, and whispered more to himself than anyone, "Truth doesn't die with silence. It waits to be heard." And in that whisper was a vow that this story wouldn't vanish like smoke, that what the cabin tried to remember wouldn't be forgotten again, not if he had breath to speak it. Weeks later, beneath the humming fluorescence of the State Bureau's cold case unit, the journal and tapes from the cabin lay spread across conference tables. Pages turned, footage dissected, the room filled with a solemn reverence reserved for sacred discoveries and unspoken traumas. Names long faded from memory re-emerged with brittle clarity, matched against missing persons files once filed away with hopeless ink. And in the days that followed, a ripple of reopened cases swept across the state. Detectives called out of retirement, family members summoned to identify artifacts they never imagined would resurface, some collapsing with grief-soaked closure, others standing in quiet rage as answers only deepened the mystery. Ray watched it all from a distance, his role reduced to testimony and trembling recollection, and when the cabin's ashes were examined, found to contain bones too old to match any known victim, and yet too many to ignore, he said nothing more, because the truth was no longer his to carry alone. And so, on a quiet morning, in a precinct office he'd walked 1,000 times, Ray opened a small glass case and pinned Valor's badge beside the department's wall of honor, not with ceremony, but with the weight of knowing it marked the end of something vast and personal. Not just a partnership, but a chapter of belief, of duty lived alongside a creature who had never once questioned the darkness they walked through together. Behind him, no applause, no send-off, only the hum of printers and the low murmur of officers chasing new ghosts. And that was how he wanted it. The old man walked home that night under a wide sky, the air crisp with winter's approach, and found Valor curled by the fire, aging bones stretched across the rug, eyes half-lidded but not asleep, never truly asleep, just watching, always watching. Ray eased into the chair beside him, the one he'd sat in after each long shift, and for a while said nothing, just let the quiet be what it was. Not empty, but earned. Then, as if someone had asked the question aloud, his voice broke softly into the stillness. Sometimes a dog doesn't just find the lost. He finds what we're afraid to admit we've forgotten. And the words hung there, unchallenged, settling like dust in the warmth of firelight. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, gentle now, as if the forest no longer needed to whisper warnings, and the world beyond the window blurred into a calm neither man nor dog fully understood, only accepted. And as the flames danced low and shadows stretched into stillness, Valor's eyes remained open, unblinking, unwavering, as if listening to things only he could hear, the last sentinel in a story no one thought would ever be told.